Now that we understand objects and prototypes, the prototypal inheritance and the prototype chain, object properties and methods, it's time to talk more deeply about building objects. We've already seen one way to build objects, which is object literal syntax. However, there are a few other ways to build objects, especially when it comes to setting the prototype. So we're going to look at them now. First, our first way of building objects, and we need to understand why they work the way they do. This is function constructors, new, and the history of JavaScript. Now, we're not going to get too deep into a history lesson, but here's what you need to know. JavaScript was built by a guy named Brandon Ike, back at a time when, much like today, there are technology wars between Google and Apple. There was technology and programming language wars between various companies like Netscape, Microsoft, Oracle, and Sun. And so, JavaScript was a language that was written for usage in the browser eventually. Not absolutely originally, but eventually that became its purpose primarily. And it was called JavaScript to attract Java developers to it, because there were a lot of Java developers, and if you don't have developers using a language, it dies. So the company that Brandon Ike worked for at the time decided to call it JavaScript to attract Java developers. Much like at the time Microsoft was touting a language in the browser called VBScript, because Visual Basic was very popular and it wanted to attract its own Visual Basic developers to VBScript. So JavaScript sounds like Java and looks a little like Java, but is nothing like Java. This is marketing. And one of the elements of marketing JavaScript was this kind of line of code. Java developers were used to creating objects like this, using the new keyword and something called a class. A class in Java is not an object, but it defines an object. And you use the new keyword to then create the object from that class. JavaScript doesn't really have classes, although there is a class keyword coming in the next version of JavaScript, but even then that isn't really a class the way it is in Java or C# or C++. So Java developers were used to creating objects like this. And so JavaScript needed a way to be able to create objects with this kind of syntax, so that when Java developers looked at JavaScript, they would say, oh, see, JavaScript is like Java. You should use it, even though it's not really. So what we have, and what we still have in JavaScript, is one approach to building objects that isn't that bad when you get down to it, once you get used to it, but does have some problems. However, even though there are new ways coming to build objects in JavaScript, this is one of those things you need to know because it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it'll be in a lot of the open source code that you might read or other projects you might get involved in if you're writing JavaScript or reading someone else's. So let's talk about function constructors and the keyword new. So let's create a new function. I'm going to call it person. And then I'm going to do something kind of interesting. I'm going to set this.firstname equal to John and this.lastname equal to Doe. And that's it. And then I'm going to stop for a moment and create a new object using this new operator, the new keyword. And we'll explain what it's doing once we see what it does. So I'll say new person. Notice I'm not just calling the function. I'm not just invoking it. I'm putting the new keyword in front of it. And then let's console.log John. Let's see what we get. I have an object that is a person with its first name John and its last name Doe. So what just happened here? Well, remember that everything we're going to talk about in this section is just about different ways to construct objects. We're not changing what objects are or how they work. We're simply utilizing features in the JavaScript language that lets us construct or build objects. To build objects, we need to create an object, give it properties and methods, and set its prototype. We set the prototype the wrong way in a previous lesson just to show how it worked. But now we're going into the right ways, or the various ways that are accepted, to create objects in JavaScript, adding properties, adding methods, and setting the prototype. So the new keyword, which we said was basically introduced to make Java and similar language developers feel comfortable, is actually an operator. Remember our JavaScript operator precedence list? You can see that new is actually an operator. So when we say new, something special happens. Immediately, an empty object is created. It would be as if we said var and then some variable and then an empty object. An empty object is created. And then it invokes the function. It calls the function. When the function is called, we know that the execution context generates for us a variable called this. In this case, in the case where you use the keyword new, it changes what the this variable points to. The this variable points to that new empty object. Imagine basically that this operator creates an empty object and then calls this function. So now the this variable is pointing to that empty object in memory that this new operator created. Now, when I add dot first name and dot last name, I'm adding it to that empty object. And as long as this function, the function that I used the new operator on, doesn't return a value, the JavaScript engine will return that object that was created by the new operator. So it created a new object, then called the function, with the this variable pointing to that empty object. And then whatever I do to that empty object using the this variable will end up as part of that object, and that's what's returned. Let's prove for starters that this is being invoked. This function is invoked. All right, let's see what we get. Yep, it invoked the function and then returned this object. If I didn't do anything to this at all, what I would end up with is what this is originally. So the this keyword, what is it? It's an empty object. It knows it's a type of person, but it's an empty object. And then I started adding properties and methods to it. See that? And that's returned. If I had returned something else, like greeting, I got in the way, that's what would get returned from the function. I would essentially be getting in the way of that JavaScript engine process. But if I don't return anything, the JavaScript engine says, okay, you invoked this function using the new operator, so I'm going to give you back the object that was set as the this variable before the function started executing, when the execution context was created. See that? So this is letting me construct an object via a function. So we call a function that's used specifically to construct an object a function constructor. Makes sense, right? Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, but what if I want to just create more people with the same properties and methods? What happens? Well, if I refresh this, you'll see that our first invocation using the new operator works, and so does our second. It's invoked again, so a different empty object is created, the function is run, and that empty object is worked on inside the function and returned. Although we have one problem. The first and last name always have these values. I can make that work a little better by remembering something very important about function constructors. Function constructors are just functions. We haven't really changed how functions work by calling the new operator. The important things are that putting the new operator in front of a function sets the this keyword to a brand new empty object, and if you don't return anything from that function, instead of returning undefined, it will return that empty object, but now worked on by you, perhaps inside that function using the this keyword. Make sense? So if I want first name and last name to be whatever I want it to be when I invoke the function, I just set parameters. So I can set first name, last name, and then you'll usually see a pattern that looks like this. Again, the this keyword is pointing to an empty object in memory. So I'm saying whatever I passed to the function, set that value as the value of this new property on my empty object that was created by the new keyword. So here I could do John and Doe for first name, last name, and here I could do Jane and Doe for first name, last name. Each invocation of the function using the new operator invokes the function, but first creates a new empty object, and these are going to be different empty objects. And then work is done using the this keyword if you like. And then as long as you don't have a return statement, the JavaScript engine will return that empty object, which you have now likely manipulated, added properties, added methods. That object sitting in that space created by the new keyword. And you can use parameters just like you would any other function. So in most cases with function constructors, you're passing some default values or set values to set as part of the object. So you'll usually see a pattern like this. I use the parameters of the function to tell the function how to construct or what values to place when it's constructing the object. This part right here, it's adding the property, and this right here is the parameter that I passed in. And you could name these differently if you wanted, but this is usually the pattern that we see because it's very clean and easy to understand what property goes with what parameter. Does that make sense? So if I run this, notice that the first new person is invoked. The new operator creates a new object. Then the function is invoked here. And then I added my first name and last name using the values I passed to the function. Then I called new person again, got a different empty object, and what I ended up with was an object with the same properties but different values because I used the values of the parameters that I passed to the function. So this is still just calling a function, no different. But by putting the new keyword in front of it, it's changed what happens with this and what's returned. So now I'm constructing objects using functions. And again, that's a function constructor. So, big word alert. Function constructors. Not that complex after all. A normal function that is used to construct objects. when you put that new keyword in front of a function call, the this variable, which is created during the creation phase of the execution context, it points to a brand new empty object. And that object is returned from the function automatically when the function finishes execution. All right, so that's function constructors, used for constructing objects. Really, the new operator makes the new object, and function constructors are used for adding properties and methods to that new object. All right, so that gets us the new properties and the new methods, but what about setting the prototype? All right, when it comes to setting the prototype with function constructors, it's actually quite easy, but looks a little confusing. That's next.